Welcome, this is Jim, host of the Faith Influencer podcast, where we're going to dive into discussions on faith's role in everyday life, from navigating blended families to overcoming challenges. I'm a husband, a father, a Bible teacher, an advocate for applying faith to everyday life. So tune in as I share personal stories, valuable insights, and practical wisdom. Welcome back. This is Jim Cunningham, Faith Influencer. I'm excited to see you again, and I'm excited about what we're going to talk about. We have been diving into the subject of blended families, and I want to start by thanking you. I've gotten so many responses that have been very encouraging. Lets me know we're on the right track. I anticipated that you're going to be nodding your head up and down as we walk through this subject because I've lived it for 15 years now, so we know what we're talking about here because we've been through it. So much of what I'm going to be talking about today, I'm going to be somewhat guilty of some of it as well. But let me know what you're thinking. Let me know any subjects or other directions you'd like to go. This comes with a lot. I don't know what stands out to you. Is it that you entered a blended family with a lot of baggage, with a lot of guilt? Is the children are the biggest issue? I was talking to someone today and they said they think that the biggest issue in blended families is dealing with exes. Well, we're going to talk about that, just not today. Maybe it's the loss of a dream. Whatever it is, there are lots of issues that come with us into blended families. So today, and then the next podcast, we're going to be talking about this subject of favoritism. Now, that's a tricky one because I'm going to launch out and say that 99% of blended families have experienced this idea of favoritism. But I'm going to approach it a little different today and how I want to share this with you. I'm going to begin with the end. I'm going to talk about the problem with it before I actually define it. Next podcast, I'll get into what the definition of favoritism is, and then I'm going to talk about how to overcome it. But I want to build a case that it's a big issue and why it's a problem before I get into the fixes, okay? I promise we'll get there next time, but let me lay out the problems. And again, I know that as we walk through this, you're going to know exactly what we're talking about. So this isn't anything new, especially the favoritism part. You can go back thousands of years. As a matter of fact, you can open up the Bible and go to the story of Joseph. Remember that story? You remember all the favoritism that happened in their blended family? If you think about that family, they had the same dad and 4 different mothers and 12 kids. Now, how do you like that blended family? And then Joseph, who was the favorite, and the dad didn't hide that Joseph was his favorite. Joseph created tension with all the other siblings, it seems like, and it created this whole dynamic. We're going to get back to that story later, but it's in the Bible. Now, I want to intentionally chase a rabbit here. I've inserted this rabbit on purpose, so I just want you to know this. Let me remind you that good people get divorced. Let me say this, and for some of you, and from my background, this sounds strange. Christian people get divorced. People who go to church get divorced. I say that because some of the responses from some of you is how you were rejected, you felt like, after going through a divorce. Good people go through a divorce. That's one. 2, it's not the unforgivable sin. I shared with you in my own story in a previous podcast that I felt like that God had put me on a shelf, that God was finished with me. I come from a background of ministry, and I thought, it's over. I've been divorced. I've failed in that area of my life. But here's what I want you to know. God's not finished with you just because you've gone through a divorce. So now, let's jump into this idea of favoritism, and I want to begin with why it's a problem. So here we go. We're going to tread lightly on some of this. Here's why it's a problem. First of all, because it always starts in silence. It always starts in silence. Here's what I mean by that. When there is favoritism in a blended family, especially when the family first comes together, it doesn't go unnoticed. Everyone sees it, but in the beginning, no one says anything. Does the spouse notice that you're paying more attention to your children than to all of the children? Yes. Does the stepchild know that he is not receiving the same attention from the step-parent that the step-parent's showing their own? Yes. Everyone sees it. Everyone notices it. And I promise you, it's not always seen when I say notice. Sometimes it's just heard throughout the house. But everyone knows it. Everyone feels it. Everyone sees it. And the spouse whose child is being left out can sense it, but everyone knows it. So don't think because it's not being discussed, no one sees it. They do. That's the first thing. But then here's the problem with that. Because it's going along in silence, it's not being discussed. We'll talk about that in a minute. The next thing that always happens, and this is where it begins to fall apart. As a matter of fact, this is one of the reasons why, unless you fix what I'm talking about, this is one of the reasons why 70% of blended families end in divorce, because resentment begins to rise. There are so many occasions in blended families for resentment to find its place. It's unimaginable, but it's there. And because there's silence in this idea of favoritism, resentment begins to rise. Let me just kind of give you a definition of resentment. Resentment would be feelings of bitterness stemming from the idea that someone is being wronged. Resentment. So resentment begins to rise. I'm going to give you some examples. So here I am, let's say, sitting in my living room. Our family's there. In my case, I have my son, and then my wife has her son. And let's just make up a scenario. I'll give you a real one in a minute, but let me make this one up. I say to my son, "Hey, bud, let's go out and play catch." He says, "Sure." He jumps up. We walk out. We play catch. We have fun. We're outside playing catch. But now let me ask you, and you already know, we're just bringing it up. What's going on inside the house? I don't care if in that case, if my wife is in the room or in the other room, she heard all of that. And my stepson that I didn't ask to come out and play catch feels it. May not say anything, may smile, but he feels it. That's what I'm talking about. Let me give you another scenario. Here's the real one. This actually happened. I'm a little embarrassed to say this. It didn't last long, but I was guilty in this area. So here's a real life scenario. So everybody's home from school. My son's doing his homework. My wife's son, my stepson, puts his backpack on the island in the kitchen. And then he goes off and does his thing. So I say to him, "Hey, would you take your backpack off the island and put it in the lockers?" He said, "Sure." He goes and does it. When my son finishes his homework, he puts everything in his backpack. He puts it on the island. I don't notice it at the time. In a little bit, I'm walking through the kitchen. I see his backpack on the island. And guess what I do? No. In this case, I didn't ask him to go put it up. I just grabbed it myself and went and put it in the locker. Now, this actually happened, and I remember it because it was an issue. You see the issue going on there? I didn't pick up my stepson. I wanted him to do it. But it wasn't such a big deal, it seemed, when my son did it. I just picked it up myself and put it up. That's the kind of stuff that some of you are telling me. I literally sit down with a man this week who was walking through with me. I told him I was going to be talking about this, and he was laying out these kinds of issues that they began to deal with. What I just described to you about the backpack, did that go unnoticed? Nope. Didn't go unnoticed. But resentment started rising because it was creating this this team concept of your team and my team. Now, let me tell you something about resentment. Resentment's like a thermometer. Now get this. Now, we've walked through this, so I can be honest about it because we've done the fixes that I'm going to talk about next time. But listen, resentment's like a thermometer. Here's what happens. Resentment can rise quickly. For my wife, as she described this to me later, she said when she observed that I asked my stepson to put the backpack up, but I didn't ask my son, I did it for him. She said it's like this thermometer, all of a sudden resentment level went straight to the top. But here's the problem. And she described this to me. And of course, I was apologetic after I realized it, but resentment goes quickly to the top, but it's very sluggish on the decline. You understand what I'm saying? When someone experiences resentment, they can get to that emotion hurriedly, but it doesn't go away hurriedly. It hangs on. She feels it that night, feels it the next day. That's the problem with resentment. It hangs on. And then it begins to create distance. This is the direction that the majority of blended families go through. So I was talking to my friend this week about this subject, and I told him this very thing. This was his question. So, will I know if my spouse is feeling distance toward me? And I tried not to laugh, but my response was, oh yeah, you'll know if she's distant. How will I know? He said, well, because you'll begin to sense something is wrong in her responses to you. I mean, here's what happened to me. So on the backpack thing, I started sensing that there was something there with my wife. So I would say to her, babe, is there something wrong? And she'd say, no, everything's fine. Well, I sensed something. A little bit later, I'd come back and I could tell they was just not the same. And so I would say to her, hey, have I offended you or something? And she'd say, no, everything's fine. Well, it wasn't, and she wasn't willing to tell me, but she was beginning to withdraw, and I could tell that some distance was happening. And so as she was withdrawing, I finally understood what was happening. And again, I'll be honest, I was embarrassed at my favoritism that I was showing towards my son, and it was creating some distance in the beginning, but we fixed it. So here's what happens next. And this is the hard part. This is the big part. So I want you to get this one. I want to spend some time here. Here's what happens next. We walk through these different doors in a blended family. It's creating some resentment. It's creating some distance. But here's the biggest issue that happens. It starts creating secrets. Now, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you're driving, listening to this, or you're watching this on our YouTube channel, you're nodding your head up and down right now because you know that the secrets have begun. Here's what I'm talking about. So when a stepchild experiences favoritism being shown, he will pull his parent or her parent aside in another room to have a private conversation. And when they do that, is that an issue? I'm going to address that in a minute. But in this case, it is an issue because now we're creating allies. This is the point in the blended family. Have you followed the steps here? This is the step we've arrived at now where we're going to begin to create teams. We're going to have her team with her children, his team with his children. And if one of them doesn't have children, we're going to have a step parent who now is an outsider. These are the steps that begin in a blended family on the trip downward to divorce. So on this downhill trajectory where we're creating allies, the kids learn to create this distance between the husband and between the wife. So, one, you cannot make a step parent, an outsider. You can't do it. There's a way to handle this. Here's how you do it. So your child comes to you and let's just say it's the mother and says, Mom, this is going on. He is showing favoritism. He's asking me to do things that he's not asking his son to do things. He's a jerk. He's whatever. He's going off on his step parent. How do you handle that? I've been asked that so many times over the years. How do I handle when my kid is mad at the step parent? You cannot make the step parent an outsider. So what you have to do is acknowledge the feelings of your child, but here's what you cannot do. You cannot allow them to be disrespectful to the step parent. That's just one of those non-negotiables. They can't be disrespectful to the step parent. They have to understand that you're married to them. So don't allow that. But you know what those kids will do? If they can pull your attention or your emotions away, they're going to do it. If they can create strife, believe it or not, they're going to do it. But do you know why your child's doing that? Because they want you to see it their way and to give in to them and to change your decision making. That's what they're trying to do with you. You're saying, you mean our kids will sow this kind of trouble within the family? They can't wait to do it. Yes, they're going to do it. That's what they do. Unless you have those boundaries up and you don't allow them to be disrespectful and to create this tension, maybe you need to say something like this. Maybe you need to say, honey, I know you're feeling this and we're going to have a discussion about this. He and I are, but I'm married to him. And so it's not allowable for you to be disrespectful. Talk to me, but we're going to always do it in a respectful way. That's how I would encourage you to handle that. So don't make them an outsider. Allow conversations. I want to say one thing about that. You know, sometimes when a child wants to talk to their parent, unless it's a manipulation kind of thing, and their parent has to be able to discern that, unless it's a manipulation kind of thing, I want to say this to you. That's okay too, that a child wants to go talk to their parent. There's more trust there naturally with their biological parent. Sometimes they want to go and sit down just with them. When they do that, here's what often happens. The step parent gets jealous. I've seen it over and over and over. You're jealous because your wife's child wants to have a private conversation. There's nothing wrong with that. Allow that to happen. I'm hoping that you can trust your spouse enough to know that they're not going to allow that to become disrespectful. Maybe they just need to have a private conversation with their kid. That's okay. Don't be jealous of that. Now let me say this last thing. If this happened this last week. If you're in a room together, in a living room, this was a parent that I was talking with, and they were telling me their latest tragedy. They're in the living room together. You've got his, hers, all there. Kids are there. Parents are there. And in this case, the mother was going to say something or answer the question that her biological child asked her. Everybody's in the living room. Got the scenario? They're all there. Her child asked her a question. But before she could answer, the step parent jumps in and answers. Now, that did not go over well. I want to encourage you that if your stepchild is asking their parent a question, don't answer it. Let their parent answer. Why did, in this case, did the husband want to answer? We actually had a conversation about this because he was afraid that his wife wouldn't answer it the way he wanted it answered. He wanted it to go a certain direction, so he wanted to get that in there before his wife said something to the child. That just creates resentment. It creates resentment with the parent, creates resentment with the child. It's just one of those rules that you can't cross over. So, secrets. Now we're going to talk about next time how we fix these things. But for now, these are the steps that begin with this downward motion to disaster. I wanted to let you know why this is so important before we talk about the fixes. So now that we know that, hang in there for next time. I'm excited to talk about the fixes. So thanks for joining us. I want to ask you to do this. I want to ask you to think about those areas that you're struggling with. As a matter of fact, if I were to ask you the single biggest challenge that you're facing in your blended family, what would it be? I want to know that because I want to make sure that we address that. I mean, we're going to address a lot of things from excess to money to on and on, but maybe there's something in particular. So just the email below here, send me a message, ask me the question. I promise we'll get to it and we'll address it. So thank you for joining us at Faith Influencer, and we will see you next time.